glad for you folks that are here and for you folks that are watching online. In 1 Samuel 14, reading from verse 1. Now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young man that bare his armor, Come and let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. Why do you think he didn't want to tell his father what he was going to do? See, the Israelites were all on one side of the situation here, of a camp. The Philistines were on the other side. They each had their own camps where they were. And the Philistines had lots of men with them, warriors. The Israelites didn't have so many. They had, the last we heard, they had, Saul had gotten 3,000 and had given 1,000, let 1,000 go with Jonathan and 2,000 with Saul. But notice here in verse 2 of chapter 14, and Saul tarried in the uttermost of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people that was with him were about 600 men. What happened to the rest of that 3,000 or 2,000 that he should have had? But what we see, first we're talking about Jonathan. Jonathan wanted to go over to the Philistines' camp, their garrison. That was like their camp, and but he didn't say anything to his dad about that. And so Saul was there under the pomegranate tree. It just shows that he wasn't busy trying to decide what to do, trying to get more men to follow him, more warriors, and just doing something about this. He was just sitting under the pomegranate tree waiting.
It seems that Jonathan was more of a warrior and more of a leader than Saul was.
Yes, definitely. And more of a believer in God.
Oh, yes.
So in verse 3, and Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, wearing an ephod, and the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. So this is just telling us that the priest, that was one that was priest at that time, whose name was Ahiah, he was with Saul. Now evidently Saul had asked him to come, and I don't know, it doesn't say that Saul had sent for him to come, but I just imagine that he did, because Saul knows that, and knew at this time, that he wasn't doing everything exactly right, and he was worried, he was afraid, and he didn't know where Samuel was, or Samuel was busy somewhere else, and Samuel had really gotten on to him for not obeying completely, and so he thought, well, I'll get the priest to come and be with me, and that'll please the Lord.
Kind of like that good luck charm that they used the ark for. It didn't work.
That's right. Leanne said that sounds like a good luck charm that they used the ark, thinking if they had the ark, it would be like a good luck charm. Well, it didn't help them,
Yeah.
but the Philistines just stole the ark, but and they did get it back. But he thought maybe the high priest would help him. Anyway, in verse 3, and Ahiah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, did I wear that? Read that?
Yeah.
Wearing an ephod. And the people knew not that Jonathan was gone. And verse 4, between the passages by which Jonathan sought to go over into the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock and on the one side and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of the one was Bezer, and the name of the other was Seneh. And so between the passages, this is the space between the Israelites' camp and the Philistines' camp. There was a passage that was a very dangerous one, really. It had a sharp rock, and as a cliff, and there was a large cliff there, and a sharp rock was on it, and that rock means a fortress. So it was more than just one rock, but there was a fortress that probably the Philistines had built. And the names of the rock was Bozez, which Bozez means shining, and Senna means a thorn, or to prick, or a bramble. What these meanings of these rocks and what we're seeing in this verse is that it was a very dangerous place between these two camps. And so if one was to go to the other camp, they would have to go through a very dangerous place. But did that stop Jonathan? Jonathan felt that the Lord was leading him. We'll see this as we go on. And so, no, that didn't bother Jonathan. He was going anyway. And he took his armor bearer with him. Verse 5, the forefront of the one was situate northward over against Michmash, and the other southward over against Gibeah. And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, come, and let us go over into the garrison of the uncircumcised. That showed what he thought of the Philistines. They were uncircumcised. They were the Gentiles. And he said, it may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. He says, there's just two of us, and there's hundreds of and probably thousands at this time of the Philistines, but right at that fort, there was at least hundreds there. And there were two on the Israelite side. But Jonathan was completely right in saying that the Lord can save by many or by few. There's no restraint, he calls it, with him. Jonathan's trust was in the Lord. It wasn't in himself or in his armor bearer, but it was in the Lord. It had to be for him to have the faith to go forward. He says, I'm sure that the Lord had dealt with his heart, and remember, Samuel had talked to them about trusting the Lord, and if they would do right, the Lord would fight for them, and just to believe the Lord for these things. Well, Saul didn't pay any attention to what Samuel had said, but Jonathan did pay attention, I'm sure, and listening to him, and his heart was right, and so the Lord gave him the faith to step forward and go, even though it was a dangerous situation, as if just looking at it naturally. Verse 7, and his armor bearer said unto him, do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee, behold, I am with thee according to thy heart. So his armor bearer was close enough to Jonathan to know him, and to know that if he had the faith to go, that was his heart, and he also believed that God would be with them. You have two against hundreds. If God is with those two, they're
the majority.
They're the majority, yes.
I have written this off my Bible. Can I say this to God?
Well, that is a question for all of us to ask. Can we say that to God? So, then in verse 8, then said Jonathan, behold, we will pass over unto these men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. If they say unto us, tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and will not go up unto them. Now I've wondered, he says, then we'll just stand here. Was he just planning on shooting them or using his sword or whatever as they started coming towards him? I don't know, but he must have had something in mind. But he says, but if they say thus, verse 10, come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord hath delivered them into our hand, and this shall be a sign unto us. So he was giving the Lord opportunity to let them know more just what to do, what steps to take. How wise that was. In Psalms 32:8, we read, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. So whether Jonathan knew this verse just by itself, I don't know. He could have, because the Israelites were taught from the time they were little boys and girls to study the scriptures, and they had to memorize many of the scriptures and all. So he may have known that. However, Saul wasn't a very religious man when the Lord chose him, and so whether he had whether he had been taught those verses and all, I don't know. If he did, whether he taught Jonathan about them, I'm not sure. But somehow Jonathan had the faith to go forward, and he had put this kind of like a fleece up before the Lord, and the Lord answered him, gave him the faith to go forward, like he said. Verse 11 says, both of them discovered themselves unto the garrison of the Philistines. Can you imagine? I just wonder how they had to have real faith and confidence to stand up and let them see them. And he said, and the Philistines, both of them discovered themselves, and the Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews come forth out of their holes where they had hid themselves. They knew that the Israelites had hidden in caves and behind rocks and places. And so verse 12, so the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will show you a thing. We'll just show you a thing. What they had in mind was, you come up to us and we'll kill you before you have a chance to get here. I'm sure that's what they had in mind. But Jonathan said unto the armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. And I look at that. He didn't say the Lord has delivered them into our hands or into my hand. He says into the hand of Israel. So Jonathan is doing right things all along here. He's not giving the credit to himself, even before he goes forth, but he does have faith in God that they will be delivered. So verse 13, Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and his feet, and his armor bearer after him. He climbed up also, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer slew after him. So these people, these warriors of the Philistines, they fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer. In other words, they began killing them as they came up, was coming to them. They just began killing them with their swords and whatever they had. But they slew after him. Verse 14, and that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men, within as it were a half acre of land. It's just a small portion of land that as these men came, they had to be in work really fast, because half an acre isn't very much property, land there. But as they came, they would kill them. And instead of them being killed, they killed them. Verse 14, it was about 20 men. Then reading from verse 15, and there was trembling in the host in the field. The host is speaking of the host of the Philistines. They began trembling. They were frightened. They couldn't understand why they were being killed so much. And they realized they could see enough to know that they were being killed, the Philistines were. So they began trembling with fear, horror and terror. And it said they began trembling among all the people. The garrison and the spoilers, this is the garrison, the ones that were in the Philistines' camp. The spoilers are just speaking of the wicked, that's speaking of wicked people. That's what they were. they also trembled. And the earth quaked, so it was a very great trembling. So the earth quaked. Whether the Lord caused a regular earthquake at that time, we don't know. It doesn't say, but the earth did quake. The Lord caused the earth to tremble and quake like it would have been an earthquake. And maybe it was. It wasn't one that lasted very long, but anyway, it was all trembling. That word trembling means anxiety exceedingly and fear. So the men who were still in the Philistines' camp, they couldn't understand it all, and they became panic-stricken, is what happened. And they saw that as the men were going towards Jonathan and his armor bearer, they were falling. They were being killed. So it would cause panic to go all through them. Even the earth began quaking. The Lord was helping. And so often we read about places like this, how the Lord will cause the enemies to get all mixed up and start killing each other. And that's what happened here. They became panic-stricken and they were killing each other, not realizing what they were doing. Verse 16, and the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked. So now Saul's people were looking to see what was going on. They could see it. And behold, the multitude melted away, and they went on beating down one another. This just means that there were thousands of, and hundreds anyway, in that fort, and others were coming, because I'm sure the Philistines were calling for help. But as they came, well, they just started falling. They started killing each other. They started falling down with terror, and they just started melting away. All of those people that were those warriors that should have been fighting, they were all panic-stricken and they were killing each other. The Lord was fighting for Israel. He was fighting because of Jonathan's faith. It's so wonderful how the Lord will come in for his people when they believe him. And he has different methods sometimes that he uses to bring the victory, but he will bring the victory when it's needed. So Saul had the people who were with him number the people who were there checking to see who were gone from them. Saul wanted to know what was going on and who it was that had gone over and started fighting with them. And so it was then realized that Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So he knew then that Jonathan had something to do with this. So in verse 18, and Saul said unto Ahiah the priest, bring hither the ark of God, for the ark of God was at that time with the children of Israel. So the children of Israel had gotten the ark of God before this was going on. And Saul says, well, bring the ark. And he's wanting to appear that he's trusting the Lord. And that's why he's asking for the ark to bring it. I don't know what he thought that he would do when the ark came, but he just wanted to appear to be religious. Verse 19, it came to pass while Saul talked unto the priest that the noise that was in the host of the Philistines went on and increased. And Saul said unto the priest, withdraw thine hand. Evidently the priest was holding up his hand and praying. This is my thinking. Otherwise I don't know why he had to withdraw his hand, but Saul saw that the priest was praying, or had his hand up anyway. And so Saul says, forget about that. We're going to go see what's going on. And so he says, withdraw your hand. And verse 20, Saul and all the people that were with him assembled themselves, and they came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow. So they were all fighting each other. And there was a very great discomfiture. I guess so. It was interesting thing that Saul saw when he came to the place of the battle. Verse 21, moreover, the Hebrews that are with the Philistines before that time, which went up with them into the camp from the country round about. So before this battle started, a lot of the Hebrews, the Israelites that were there in that country, they left the Israelites and joined with the Philistines. They probably saw that Saul wasn't being a good leader, and that the Philistines were they had a lot more people fighting for them, and they didn't want to be on the side of the ones that was losing, so they left. What is that called when someone leaves one country for another? Deserted. They deserted the Israelites and went over and to be with the others. Well, now they saw the Israelites were winning the battle, and so they came back to the Israelites where they belonged to. But it did cause more and more people to come to fight with them. And then there was more than that. It says they came to them in the camp from the country round about. Even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. So those probably 3,000 men that were with Saul and Jonathan, but they had been hiding in rocks and caves during this first part of this time because they were afraid, frightened. None of them were trusting the Lord. The only ones we see trusting God was Jonathan, and then his armor bearer was following him. But these others, probably of that 3,000, and then even more were coming. They started coming back to help the Israelites also. So, verse 22, and it goes ahead with that. Likewise, all the men of Israel which had hid themselves in Mount Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, even they also followed hard after the Israelites there in the battle. So, the Lord was dealing with all of them. Verse 23, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over unto Bethaven. So the Lord was fighting for Israel. It's so interesting the ways that he uses to fight, ways that we wouldn't even think about and wouldn't realize what he could do and so on. It's not hard for the Lord. When he wants to do something, he just has plenty of ways to do what he wants accomplished. That helps us to believe the Lord more. That's why it's so good, so important for us to read about how God worked in the different ones in the Old Testament and all through the New Testament also. God will fight for his people. If your heart is right before the Lord, you can trust the Lord to do exactly what is needed and what is best. And if he doesn't do things just like we think he should, then he has a reason for that too. But we can trust him, and we can just let him work in the way that he knows is needed. So the Lord saved Israel that day. And going on now into verse 24, and the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, saying, cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged of mine enemies. So none of the people tasted any food. So Saul had given this order to all of those warriors that were following him, as few as they were, but he said, don't eat any food until evening. I don't know just why he gave that order, except unless he didn't want them to take time to eat, find food to eat and to get food, because they probably didn't have the animals right there where they were, they would need to kill to have something to eat. But anyway, Saul had told them, don't eat any food, so they didn't. But it was getting along towards evening, and they were getting weak. They were hungry, and they had been busy, and they were weak. And so, but they weren't eating any food because he had said, cursed be the one that would. Verse 25, all they of the land came to a wood, and there were honey, and there was honey up on the ground. And that wasn't an uncommon thing in those days. You know, the Lord told them, I'll give you a land of something, milk and honey. But there was a lot of bees, and they would have honey, and it would drop on the ground. And so the men could have eaten some of that honey, but they didn't, because they didn't want to be cursed. Verse 26, when the people were come to the wood, behold, the honey dropped, but no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan heard not when his father charged the people with the oath. Wherefore he put forth the end of his rod that was in his hand, and dipped it in the honey, and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes were enlightened. Eating that honey caused him to be able to, it says his eyes were enlightened. It just caused him to have more strength, more life came into him. And probably there was something of the Lord, that the Lord had done this also to cause his eyes to be enlightened, just to cause him to have more strength and know more what to do, and so on. Then answered one of the people and said, Thy father straitly charged the people with an oath, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food this day. And the people were faint. Then said Jonathan, My father has troubled the land. See, I pray you, how mine eyes have been enlightened, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much more, if haply the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found? And for had there not been now a much greater slaughter among the Philistines? He says, they would have killed even more men if my father hadn't given that order. And here again we see that Jonathan was far wiser than Saul was. And it was because he was trusting the Lord more, and the Lord was giving him wisdom. Saul had not obeyed the Lord completely. Saul's heart was not as it should be, and so God was not leading Saul. And the verse 31, they smote the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. And the people flew upon the spoil then, after what Jonathan had said, and took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground, and the people did eat them with the blood. Now, what was wrong with that?
God told them they weren't to eat anything with the blood.
They had been given orders, and they all knew it. They were not to eat anything with the blood. So it wasn't necessarily that they ate something that God was very displeased with, but that they disobeyed God here in eating with the blood. So, verse 33, then they told Saul, saying, Behold, the people sin against the Lord, and that they eat with the blood. And he said, Ye have transgressed, roll a great stone unto me this day. He says, You have sinned. And so then he asked them to roll a big stone to them. It was probably because he was going to, we'll see what he did. Verse 34, Saul said, Disperse yourselves among the people, and say unto them, Bring me hither every man and his ox, and every man his sheep, and slay them here, and eat, and sin not against the Lord in eating with the blood. And all the people brought every man his ox with him that night, and slew them there. So that evening, Saul had them bring a big rock, and they could kill the animal on that rock. Also, I think, because later on, in verse 35, let's read that. And Saul built an altar unto the Lord, and the same was the first altar that he built unto the Lord. Saul could have used that rock to build the altar with. I'm not sure, the Bible doesn't say. But he did use it to kill some of the animals and maybe to build his altar. That's the first altar he had built to the Lord. We see Saul taking these little steps, trying to please the Lord, is what I think he was doing. He wasn't obeying completely, and he realized that, and so he didn't have God's blessing, and Samuel had gotten on to him enough where he realized wasn't in God's favor, so he was doing little things to try to get God's favor. We can, looking at it the way we do now, we can see how wrong that was. But do we do things like that? If we don't feel that we're in God's favor, do we do this or that or the other, just using our own minds to try to see what we can do to please the Lord? I see people doing that, and I'm sure I have. I don't remember any definite times, but I'm sure that I have done that, and I know that people do that. Using our own minds, our own, can't say own wisdom because it's not wisdom.
Ingenuity?
Yes, to try to please the Lord. The Lord isn't interested in all of those things. He's not interested in all of the good works we can do. What he's wanting is a heart that loves the Lord. If we have a heart that loves the Lord, remember Jonathan's armor bearer said, do what's in your heart. And he was doing what was in his heart. And the Lord was blessing him mightily, giving him great victories. But here, Saul built the altar, verse 36. And Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and spoil them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seemeth good unto thee. So Saul wanted to just go out and continue fighting that battle. And but notice said, then said the priest, let us draw near hither unto God. So the priest did have a good understanding, more than Saul did here. And he said, well, let us draw near to God. Verse 37, and Saul asked counsel of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Wilt thou deliver them into the hand of Israel? But he answered him not that day. So Saul decided to do what the priest said, and so he asked God, shall we go and fight the Philistines? And God didn't answer him. And Saul said, draw ye near hither, all the chief of the people, and know and see wherein this sin hath been this day. Saul had enough understanding of God to know that since he didn't answer him, it might have been because there was sin in the camp. And verse 39, for as the Lord liveth, which saveth Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. And there was not a man among all the people that answered him. Why wouldn't the people answer him? They didn't want Jonathan to die. They knew that Jonathan was the one that had disobeyed Saul. But it's interesting to me that even though what Saul was doing was from his own thinking, wasn't really what God had told him to do, yet because the disobedience was there, God still wouldn't bless. He was not letting them do what it was needed because there was sin, and that was the sin. Saul had called an oath, a curse on the ones that disobeyed there. And Jonathan had disobeyed. Did Jonathan know he was disobeying?
Not when he ate the first.
No, he didn't know that was a disobedience. But God still, the disobedience was there, God still would not answer. So what does that show about God?
He's righteous and holy.
He is holy, he is righteous, and there was sin there, and even though he didn't know it, God knew that Jonathan didn't know when he was eating that, but God still wanted that to be taken care of. He wanted that sin to be taken care of. And he knew that Jonathan wasn't going to have to die, even though Saul had said that whoever sinned would have to die. And so they, in verse 40, then said he unto all Israel, be ye on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side. And the people said unto Saul, do what seemeth good unto thee. The people were going along with Saul. They didn't want Jonathan to be killed, but they knew that also that God was involved here. And so, therefore, in verse 41, Saul said unto the Lord God of Israel, give a perfect lot. And Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. He says, Saul said that I and my son will be on one side and all the rest of you on another, and we'll let the Lord choose which ones where the sin has been. I'm sure he didn't think that Jonathan would have been on the one of the ones that was sinning. He didn't know that, and he didn't probably think it. But then Saul said, verse 42, cast lots between me and Jonathan my son, and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. And Jonathan told him and said, I did but taste a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, and lo, I must die. So evidently Jonathan was ready to die for doing that. And Saul answered, God do so and more also, for thou shalt surely die, Jonathan. And the people said unto Saul, shall Jonathan die, who hath wrought this great salvation in Israel? God forbid. As the Lord liveth, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has wrought with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, that he died not. This is interesting to me to see how God was working through it all. He knew that the people would not allow Jonathan to have died, and yet God had said, God was the one that showed that Jonathan was the one that sinned. I don't always understand God. I think there's times when we won't understand when God is doing something in our lives or in the lives of our people. We won't always understand God, but we must agree that God is right. Whatever God does is right. God is righteous and holy, and he will do what is right, and he wants us to believe him and accept what he does. And you do the rest of the figuring out of it.
It had to speak to Saul to see the people stick up for Jonathan.
Oh,
It had
yes.
to do something to it.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
I think, I mean, picture in my mind when I was a kid in a Western movie in the cavalry came and everybody stands up and cheers and said the cavalry cheer. That's what I think about these people. They finally did finally did something right. You know, finally. But again, you know. But you know, I think it's the same thing. I mean, we know Jonathan's heart was not to sin, was not to do that.
Oh.
You think about David and his thing, you see, and he should, you know, for the law's sake, he should have been struck dead on the spot. And yet, I mean, he repented. His heart was right before God, but nothing. I mean, he did suffer for it later, but according to the law, he didn't pay the penalty of the law then.
Not
So
right
God-
then, but
God-
he did suffer
he suffered,
much.
yes.
So, anyway,
Oh,
Saul took the kingdom over Israel. Well, I'll read verse 46. Then Saul went up from following the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. That stopped the fighting right then. So Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side. That's what was interesting to me also, how finally Saul is beginning to reign as a king, take care of their enemies. He's beginning to have enough confidence to do what is right. He fought against against Moab and the children of Ammon, and against Edom, kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines, and whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them. In other words, wherever he went, he was fighting battles for Israel. And he gathered a host and smote the Amalekites, and delivered Israel out of the hands of them and spoiled them. It just meant took things from them, whatever they wanted. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan, and it goes ahead and reads his family and reads then his wife and so on. And he gathered a host and smote all of these others. Then the rest of the chapter gives the names of his sons and daughters, and of Saul and his wife, and the name of the captain, and so on. And there was war against the Philistines all the days of Saul, and Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him. So he was beginning to do what was right. My time is up. I've taken you 3 minutes past time, so we'll close there for now and have chapter 15, the Lord willing, next week.
Didn't Samuel say, the king that you'll choose will take your men?
Yes, he did.
And that's what's happening
Yeah,
here.
that's right.
He took them.
Yes,
You want me to go turn this off?
yes. So we need to give heed to these lessons and trust the Lord and let Him make these decisions and do what He wants us to do all of the time.